The logic seems obvious. When the government takes a bigger cut of your paycheck, working late suddenly feels like a bad deal. If your hourly rate drops after taxes, the natural response is to pack up your bag and go home. Why stay if you aren't getting paid the full amount? But human behavior rarely fits into a straight line. In public finance, raising taxes doesn't automatically mean people work less. Economic models and real-world data often show labor supply remaining steady or even increasing after a tax hike. A proportional tax triggers a mathematical tug-of-war between two opposing forces, substitution and income. To see which one wins, we have to deconstruct the foundational model of tax and labor. This chart maps out a worker's daily constraints. The horizontal axis represents a person's total available time, or T. Every hour must be divided into either working hours, L, or leisure, H. The vertical axis tracks the income generated from that work. The diagonal line connecting total possible income down to total leisure is the budget line. Its slope is the market wage rate, W, which dictates the maximum income possible for every hour traded away from free time. We represent personal preference with the indifference curve, I0. The spot where this preference curve perfectly kisses the budget line is point A. Here, the worker's marginal rate of substitution exactly matches the wage rate. At this point, the worker consumes H0 hours of leisure. The remaining time on the axis, from H0 to T, is L0. This is the labor actually supplied to the market. Point A represents the mathematically optimized work-life balance for this individual before any government intervention. Now, the government imposes a proportional income tax, T. Your after-tax wage drops to 1 minus TW. On the chart, the entire budget line pivots inward, becoming flatter to reflect the lower effective wage. If the reward for working drops, the immediate instinct is to assume the worker will scale back their hours. This is the substitution effect. Because the wage is lower, the opportunity cost of leisure is cheaper. You aren't giving up as much money to take an hour off. We see this as a slide along the original preference curve toward a hypothetical intermediate point C. Isolated, the substitution effect always pulls in one direction. It encourages more leisure and reduces the labor supply. But the lower wage also makes the worker poorer in real terms, triggering a second simultaneous consequence. This is the income effect. Mechanically, we see the movement from the intermediate point C to the final equilibrium, point B. Being poorer forces the worker to cut back on consumption. Assuming leisure is a normal good, the worker can no longer afford to take as much time off. To consume less leisure within a fixed 24-hour day, the individual must spend those hours working. They increase their labor supply to defend their standard of living. One effect says work less because it pays less, while the other says work more because you are poorer. The final labor supply is decided by this tug-of-war. The outcome depends entirely on which effect exerts greater mathematical force. If the desperation to maintain income outweighs the desire for cheap leisure, the labor supply expands after the tax hike, creating the logic for a backward-bending supply curve. Suppose the government must collect a specific amount of tax revenue.
We have to determine which structure, proportional or progressive, damages work motivation more. Line AB' represents a neutral lump sum tax that collects the revenue without changing the wage rate. The intersection of these potential balances forms the price-consumption curve, or PCC. Point A is the equilibrium under a linear progressive tax. While it offers an exemption, it must apply a steep tax rate on every dollar earned above that limit to hit the revenue target. This creates a high marginal tax rate at the point of choice. Compare this to point B, a proportional tax collecting the same revenue. The slope is gentler, and point B sits on the higher indifference curve, IB, meaning the worker achieves a higher level of utility. The progressive tax causes a larger reduction in labor because its steep slope at the margin triggers a more powerful substitution effect. The structure of marginal rates dictates the magnitude of economic distortion. The steepness of the tax line at point A shows that how we tax the next dollar earned matters more than the total amount we collect. What happens if a worker has a rigid routine and refuses to trade work for free time, regardless of the wage? We define this as a preference for perfect complements, represented by an L-shaped indifference curve. The worker demands a fixed ratio of income and leisure. meeting the budget line at the corner, point E. When we apply the tax and pivot the budget line, there is no smooth slope to slide along. The substitution effect is exactly 0, and the choice drops directly down to point F. Only the income effect remains. Because the worker is poorer, they must consume less leisure, which mathematically forces their labor supply to increase. Even in this extreme case, the framework of substitution and income correctly predicts the behavioral shift. These models are precise, but real-world labor markets contain friction that complicates these clean geometric proofs. Most employees cannot choose to work exactly 7.2 hours to maximize their utility. In a standard job, you often face a rigid choice between working 8 hours or 0. Widespread behavior changes the market itself. This diagram shows the labor supply curve, S, shifting left as individuals reduce hours. This collective reduction forces the market equilibrium from E up to W1, meaning the pre-tax wage actually rises as a secondary effect. Empirical data is equally messy. Surveys often fail to capture true behavior because people may not perceive their own shifts in motivation, while different econometric methods frequently yield conflicting results. Despite these market frictions, the balance of substitution and income remains the primary tool for identifying how tax policy distorts human effort. Analyzing the geometry of work-life balance reveals that marginal tax rates are the primary drivers of labor distortion. In the modern gig economy, the rigid 8-hour workday is disappearing. Freelancers and contractors now have nearly perfect minute-by-minute control over their labor supply. If your platform offered you less money per task tomorrow, which force would take over? Would you clock out because the reward is too low, or work 3 extra hours to make rent? Map your own point A on the curve and share your thoughts in the comments.